150 years ago, if you can believe it, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to approve a formal declaration of colonial independence from British rule. This is your history lesson for the day. Because this week, we will gather around barbecue grills, we will watch parades, we will wave around some sparklers and maybe shoot off some fireworks, all in the name of celebrating this revolutionary declaration of 13 colonies who just wanted to be free. Now, this was not their first step, nor would it be the last on the colonists' slow and steady march to freedom. But it was a moment. It was a moment that still calls us to stop and reflect on the nature of freedom. A moment that calls us to take stock of how far we've come, but also to take heart for how far we still have left to go. Because the road of freedom still stretches out before us, always drawing us forward, calling us into a future where all of God's people are free. Another famous advocate for freedom, Nelson Mandela, offers a similar reflection about the ongoing work of freedom. He ended his autobiography with these words: "I have walked that long road to freedom. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not ended." With these powerful words, Mandela encouraged us to keep moving forward, because the long road to freedom beckons us all to keep moving, because our journey isn't over yet. Our long walk is not over. And while we find ourselves still slowly making our way along this long road to freedom, our scripture passage this morning takes us back to the beginning. Not the very beginning, but a new beginning for the Israelites, as they throw off the shackles of slavery in Egypt and take their first few steps into freedom. In the wake of the devastation following the final plague, Pharaoh finally relented and agreed to let the people go. So they quickly gathered their belongings, they ate the unleavened bread that didn't have time to rise, and they set out on their journey. But they didn't set out at a leisurely pace. They didn't leave skipping or dancing in the streets. There weren't any floats. This wasn't a parade that they were having. This was a flight to freedom. And Scripture describes how they left in arms. Some translations say they set out from Egypt as if for war. It's a small detail, but it speaks to the mindset of the people as they set out on this journey to freedom. They took up their arms, what little that they had, because they knew that freedom doesn't come easy. And it's not a given, because the powers that be live in fear of that power being taken away. So they'll do anything they can to hold on to it. So the Israelites left ready to fight for their freedom if they had to. They knew that freedom doesn't come easy, but they didn't know that God had other plans. While the people knew in their heads that they might have to fight for freedom, God knew that they weren't ready for the reality of that fight. So instead of leading them along the most direct route, God led them on a roundabout way through the desert to get to the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea as we know it. And this was to avoid going through the land of the Philistines, as we heard, a fierce tribe that you may know from a much later story that would pit a giant Philistine warrior against a shepherd boy with good aim. God knew how easy it would have been for the Israelites to lose heart on the long and difficult road to freedom if they faced a fight right from the get-go. Because when we face adversity, God knows that it's easy for us to throw up our hands and to give up because we're just a bunch of nobodies. What can we do against Pharaoh or the Philistines? God knew that the Israelites weren't ready for a full-on battle, especially with the Philistines, at least not yet. For now, it was just enough for the people to take their first few steps along the road to freedom. They didn't have to slay the giant right away. They just had to put one foot in front of the other and trust that God would lead them in the right direction. Sometimes we don't know how to start. We don't know how to bring about the change that we want to see in the world or in our families or in our communities or even in our own lives. We get discouraged because all we can see is the giant in front of us. But God is there saying, "Follow me. Let me be your guide. I know another way. All you have to do is take a step in the right direction. And each step will make you stronger until at some point that giant won't seem so big." About 30 years ago, Tim O'Brien wrote a powerful collection of connected semi-autobiographical short stories that follow a semi-fictional company of soldiers in the Vietnam War. Some of you may have read this book. In the title story, The Things That They Carried, O'Brien introduces the men of Alpha Company through the things that they carried. He lists the weapons and the rations that they all carried. He catalogs the weight of the specialized equipment carried by some of the men depending on their rank or their specialty. He lists the various supplies and the personal items that they carried, the mementos and the good luck charms. But beyond all of the stuff that weighed them down, O'Brien gives us a beautiful glimpse, a heartbreaking glimpse, into the less tangible weight that the men carried as well. This is what he writes. He says, "They shared the weight of memory. They took up what others could no longer bear. Often they carried each other, the wounded or the weak. They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die. Grief, terror, love, longing, these were intangibles, but the intangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They carried shameful memories. They carried the common secret of cowardice. They carried their reputations." As the Israelites left Egypt, we're told how Moses carried the bones of Joseph with them. For over 400 years, Joseph's remains had laid in Egypt with the promise that one day they would be taken back to the land of his ancestors. And by taking up his bones, the people were taking up the memory of who they had been before enslaved by a Pharaoh who didn't remember Joseph. By taking up his bones, they were reclaiming the promise that God had made to their ancestors. They were being reborn as the people of God's covenant with Abraham. They carried Joseph's bones. But that's not the only memory that they carried out of Egypt. They also carried the scars of their abuse and the mistreatment. They carried the mark of the overseer's whip on their bodies and the pain of over 400 years of being made to feel less than human. They carried the grief for generations that hadn't lived long enough to take those first few steps towards freedom. They carried the expectations for what freedom would look like and fears about what it might bring. They carried their doubts as well as their hopes. And some of these things would hold them back on their journey to freedom, but others would help them find the strength to keep going. For better or for worse, the things we carry have an impact on us. They weigh us down. But whether they hold us back or help us move forward depends on how much power we give them. We all have baggage from our past, but some suitcases are better than others. And as I think about the people taking up arms and Moses carrying the bones of Joseph on their way to freedom, I can't help but think of a series of photographs taken by Tom Kiefer a few years ago. See, back in 2001, Kiefer left his job as a graphic designer in Los Angeles, and he moved to the Arizona desert, where he took a job as a part-time janitor so he could focus more time and energy on his photography. And after a few years of working in this place as a janitor, Kiefer asked his employer if he could restart a former project of taking confiscated food to a nearby shelter instead of just throwing it out. So, receiving permission, Kiefer started sorting through the bags of confiscated items instead of just throwing them away. But what he found made him start saving more than just prepackaged food. See, Tom Kiefer was a janitor at a U.S. Customs and Border Protection facility in Arizona. And the confiscated items that he was in charge of discarding and throwing away had belonged to immigrants crossing the border. When taken into custody, anything deemed non-essential or dangerous was confiscated from anyone crossing that border. And the list of non-essential and dangerous items is pretty comprehensive. So for over 5 years, Kiefer collected and saved these little bits of everyday life that he found. He found wallets and combs, tubes of toothpaste and bars of soap. He saved rolls of toilet paper and wrapped bottles wrapped up in scraps of clothing to carry water. Along with candy bars and cans of food, he collected clothing and keychains. For over 5 years, in the early 2000s, he saved these small testimonies of people seeking to be free. And then, back in 2014, he started taking pictures of these items. Through his camera lens, he brought to life the stories of the people who arm themselves with everyday objects on the road to freedom. But of all the things that he saved, all of the things that he photographed, the most poignant to me were the rosaries. In the past few weeks, this one particular picture of Kiefer's, this picture of confiscated rosaries, has become just one of the many heartbreaking images of what's been taken from families crossing the border. And they stand silent witnesses, these holy beads, as varied and as beautiful as the people who carried them, stand as a powerful testimony, still holding the hopes and the fears and the people trying to be free. The road to freedom may seem long. It still stretches out in front of us no matter where we find ourselves on it today. And it may seem impossible, but the good news is that we do not travel this road alone. The end of our scripture passage says how God went before the Israelites as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and God did not fail to lead them. We may not have these same exact signs of God's presence with us, but that doesn't mean God is any less present. God was there with the Israelites as a shade from the heat of the day and a light in the darkness. Beloved of God, we make God's love real in the shelter that we extend to others in the heat of the day and the light that we shine into the darkness. We practice the peace of Christ in offering a drink of cool water to our brothers and our sisters on this shared journey to freedom. You may not be ready to slay the giant, but we're all called to pick up our bones, to arm ourselves with whatever we have, and to follow God's leading, one step at a time. Beloved of God, may God give you the strength to keep going, for we are not quite there yet. Amen.